So I'm going to start out with a quote from a great American philosopher, George Carlin, the comedian, who said, "It's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it." And so, that's very pessimistic. I'm not sure that I'm that pessimistic about the future, but I'm getting there. The more I thought about this the last few days and gathered my notes for my talk today. So I'm going to start out with, I think there's in my mind, there's two prime elements of the American dream. And one is to be able to pursue the occupation of your choice. That's kind of like a general prime tenet of what we kind of stand for in America or have in the past. And increasingly, it's more and more difficult to pursue your occupation of choice because of occupational licensing laws. So to look at back in 1950, only 5% of occupations were licensed. But today, it's 30% of occupations are licensed, and it's growing. So it's increasingly more difficult to just set up your own shop and start a business of your own in the area that you want to pursue. So I think that's a real diminishment of what most people would consider the American dream. In Nevada, it takes 733 days and a fee of $1,500 to become not a nurse, but a travel guide. So just to be a travel guide, for example, at Lake Mead, you have to spend more than 2 years in training to do that occupation. And I think it's a case where the left has kind of overplayed their hand, and I think they've created so many barriers now to occupations around the country that it's actually gotten to the point of being absurd, like this example. So I know when I was at the APPI meetings in Las Vegas earlier this year, Chip Miller talked about, he's the president of IJ, the Institute for Justice, and he talked about this as like a prime area for the future to go after, just because these barriers have become so pervasive and so extreme and so unrelated to actually practicing the occupation well. And of course, the impact tends to be disproportionately on the poor and low income groups. So it's a huge drag on entrepreneurship. So I think that's, unfortunately though, we've seen a growth in that over time. And I think it's led to a real diminishment in the American dream, especially for a lot of low income people. And another item that I wanted to point out is workforce dropouts, which is becoming a real problem it's a big problem in Europe already, but it's becoming a huge problem here in America. So 30 years ago, 1 in every 16 men of prime working age between the ages of 25 and 54, so people you'd expect to be in the workforce, 1 in 16 30 years ago were not in the workforce, meaning they didn't have a job and they weren't looking for a job. Today, it's 1 in 8, so it's doubled, actually more than doubled because the population has gotten bigger. So, and economists are having a hard time explaining exactly why this is happening. A lot of people are looking into this, but it's a huge diminishment in people in their prime working years who aren't working and aren't contributing productively to the economy. One explanation is there's been a huge spike in the Social Security disability insurance program. So it's kind of like the income program of last resort. So a lot of people are turning to that and living off these programs. But it's hard to achieve the American dream when you stop working. So I think that's another critical factor that I know Europe has kind of led in that, unfortunately, with their social welfare programs, but I think we're catching up. So, that's another thing to watch in the future as a reason for the gradual, or maybe in this case, rapid diminishment of the American dream. Now, I think another key element of the American dream is home ownership. And in the Bay Area, as we know, it's so I'll use darn expensive to find a place to live. And it's kind of creeping across the country. And I think, so 3 areas I just kind of wanted to mention quickly in this area. One is the Bay Area politicians love affordable housing mandates, right? Inclusionary zoning is the other word for it. So if you build a development, a housing development, you have to make sure that a certain percentage of the housing is sold below market rate. And that percentage, well, we just kind of had a battle in San Francisco to up that percentage, so there's kind of a fight ongoing here. But if you have to sell something below market rate, of course, if you're the developer, that's a tax. So what happens when you tax something? You get less of it. And that's what we're seeing with these inclusionary mandate zoning rules. So for example, housing production, if you look at housing production in the Bay Area before inclusionary zoning and after, my colleague Ben Powell at the Independent Institute did this study. Housing production dropped 30% in the Bay Area after inclusionary zoning was enacted. And as I said, I mean, there's ongoing debates to increase that percentage, so effectively to increase the tax. Right now the tax is about $44,000 on average per unit that you're going to lose because of this inclusionary zoning. In Los Angeles and Orange County, new housing production dropped 60% after inclusionary housing mandates were enacted. So it's a huge reduction in the housing stock long term, and of course, reduce the supply of something, the price is going to go up. In California, just a little factoid, about 85,000 units of residential housing are built every year in California. For a state of 38 million people, that doesn't really sound like enough, right? It turns out you need about probably between, depending on what area of the state you're in, but like 2 to 5 times more than what we're currently building to even make a dent in the shortage of housing and to bring down the long-term price of it. Another factor that probably a lot of people don't think about in terms of propping up housing prices is if you can control water, you can control housing. And so in California, what we're seeing a lot of is show me the water laws. These are laws either at the local level or at the state level that says before you can build something, you have to assure us that you're going to have enough water for those units that you're building. But the proof is really severe. Like in California, there's 2 laws that require that you show you can provide water for about 20 years for the housing units that you want to build, and if you want to build more than 500 units. So what's happening is and it stopped dozens of projects from going forward because the water just isn't there that they can show long term. So it slows down construction. In some cases, things aren't built. But what it really has done long term is it makes developers scale back their projects. So instead of building 1,000 units, they scale it back to 600 or something like that instead. So again, another driving force in reducing the overall long-term housing stock. Of course, what really should be done, right, is free up the water supply in California. Let the price of water truly reflect its actual scarcity in California. Let water flow throughout the state. Randall and he peer-reviewed a book I'm working on, and we've had discussions on this, but Randall, I think, is right that if you freed up the water supply in California, more of it would flow to the urban areas, and you wouldn't need all these restrictions, and you could build the homes that need to be built. One last point in terms of the restrictions on housing construction in California is Plan Bay Area. And probably a lot of you guys have heard about it. Here's the actual plan. We have to have a plan, of course. This is California. So you have to have a thick, heavy plan. This is the master plan for housing development, road construction, and land use in California for the next, or actually for the Bay Area, and now 9 counties around the Bay Area, for about the next 25 years. And just briefly, what the plan does is so here's a picture of the Bay Area, the 9 counties. You see all that green space? That's 75% of the land in California, and it's off limits to development. So all that green you see on this map, you cannot build on this. So that means you can only build in about 25% of what's left. And Plan Bay Area, what it will do is it will force construction for residential housing in the future onto about 5% of Bay Area's land. So it's a real stack and pack plan. It's going to increase density, it's going to increase prices, and most of that 5% where that construction will go to accommodate about 2 million more people are going to move in to the Bay Area over the next 25 years, 20, 25 years. So that those 2 million people are going to be forced into this 5% of land that they're allowing to accommodate new residential construction going forward. And it turns out most of it is minority areas. So, one man's blight's another man's home. So basically they're targeting low-income neighborhoods for this new housing in the future. So add up all those factors: water, inclusionary zoning, Planned Bay Area. What you get is a lot less housing stock than you would if you freed it up. And what we need to do is build, build, build. And that's the only thing that's going to bring the prices down around here. Thank you.